Is it just me, or are the nights getting longer? We're here in Kilfane Church, County Kilkenny. It's a fine example of a medieval parish church. A lot of the ruined churches we see around the country were churches of monasteries or friaries or houses of canons. But this is just an ordinary parish church of modest size where a resident priest would have said Mass every Sunday for all the local people, baptisms would have taken place, and marriages and so on. What's most interesting about this place though is this enormous funerary monument of a knight. It dates to the early 14th century and it was made locally, but in all its features, it's just like other monuments to knights at this time in England, except that it's larger than any of them. This is the largest sculpture of a knight in these islands. This cross-legged pose is popular in knightly monuments in England, for example, although we're not sure exactly what it signifies. He's wearing chain mail, with the chain mail coiffed to protect his neck and head. And he even has mittens made of chainmail to protect his hands. Over the mail you can see the folds of a linen surcoat. He's got his sword, he's got rowel spurs, these pointed wheels attached by leather straps to his feet to goad on his horse, and he's got a triangular shield. The coat of arms on this shield tells us that he's a member of the Cantwell family, an English family who ended up in the Irish Midlands as part of the Norman invasion. Locally, this fella is known as Cantwell Fada, Long Cantwell, but when a few other clues are taken into account, he can be identified more precisely. He was a knight by the name of Thomas de Cantwell, and he died around the year 1320. He turns up as a witness in a handful of documents associated with Edmund Butler, the Earl of Carrick, and it seems likely that it was Edmund Butler or his father Theobald who knighted Thomas de Cantwell. That's definitely what we find with later generations of Cantwell knights. They're knighted by the Butlers. And we know that Edmund Butler loved making knights. On one occasion, he knighted 30 men in Dublin Castle. Now in this period, these knights weren't just dressing up in fancy gear, they were military men and they were active in military campaigns. So in 1302, for example, this man, Thomas de Cantwell, along with Edmund Butler, was called up by the King of England to fight in Scotland against William Wallace and his rebels.
They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
So in other words, he was on the side of the baddies in Braveheart. Just over a decade later, the Scots invaded Ireland, led by Edward the Bruce. The Gaelic Irish are delighted at this invasion. There are hopes that this would be the end of English rule in Ireland. But it all ends at the Battle of Fart, where the Scottish army is defeated by an army led by, among others, Edmund Butler. And we can be fairly sure that his sidekick, Thomas de Cantwell, was alongside him. Apart from these major military campaigns, this knight would have been involved in local policing and security, especially in relation to Gaelic Irish families who were keen on making incursions into this rich agricultural land. So we find Thomas being granted the right to negotiate with the O'Brennans and other Irish felons that is in the eyes of the Anglo-Normans. Thomas Cantwell is clearly a trusted member of the colonial machine. In 1319, finally, he turns up in a document being excused from attending an event because of tiredness and old age. Now we don't know when or how Thomas was made a knight. Sometimes the ceremony was very informal. It happened sometimes on the battlefield that a lord or king would take someone, give them a slap and say, "You're a knight now." But it's not impossible that young Thomas went through the more substantial ceremony that had developed by his time. If he did, here's what would have happened. Thomas would first have made a good confession. Then, the evening before his knighting, he would have washed himself in a bath, symbolizing the fact that he was leaving behind evil living. Then he would have gone and lain down in a freshly made bed with clean white sheets. The bed symbolized the good conscience that he was to maintain as a knight. And then before he fell asleep in that bed, a group of knights would have come to him to dress him in new linen clothes, black trousers to remind him that he came from dust and to dust he must return, a white girdle, a symbol of chastity, and a scarlet cloak to remind him that he must be willing to shed his blood for Christ and the church. Then the knights would have led him into the church, maybe even this very church, and he would have remained all night in prayer, asking the Lord to make him faithful in his service. In the morning, it was time for Mass and the reception of Holy Communion. After Mass then, the one who was to make Thomas a knight, presumably one of the butlers, would have put these spurs on his feet. That's where we get the expression to win your spurs. Then the sword was girt on him, and finally he'd have been welcomed into knightly service with a kiss as a sign of peace and love and loyalty, and a slap as a reminder to behave like a proper knight. Now, we don't know anything really about Thomas de Cantwell's behaviour. We don't know if he was a menace to the vulnerable or their defender. We don't know if he was just and merciful or corrupt and cruel. But we do know that by having this monument placed here in the parish church after his death, he was asking all the local people, the people he had sworn to defend, to pray for him, that he might be received into another kingdom, the kingdom which knows no violence or conflict, the kingdom in which knights are happily unemployed.